You may never have heard of the Open Government Federal Advisory Committee. Well, too late. Operating under the auspices of the General Services Administration, it's another casualty of the Trump administration's cutbacks. For one view of what the committee did and why this matters, we turn to its former chairman. He's now executive director of the American Governance Institute, Dan Schuman. Dan, good to have you with us.
So good to be back. Thanks for having me.
And the Open Government Federal Advisory Committee, tell us more about, let's talk about what it did first.
Sure. So it wasn't around for very long. The Open Government Federal Advisory Committee was created at the end of last year, and its purpose was twofold. One was to give advice to the administration on its recommendations for its commitments over a 2-year process, part of the National Action Plan. And the other thing was to provide advice to the federal government on emerging transparency issues to try to help the government be more open, accountable, transparent, and participatory.
And you mentioned the national agenda.
Yeah, so the United States government for the last 10 or 12 years has gone through this national action planning process where every 2 to 3 years it comes out with a plan with a number of recommendations that the agencies commit to move government transparency and accountability forward.
All right. And so the committee, who was on it and where did they come from?
Yeah, so it's a 15-member committee, or at least it was a 15-member committee. We had federal employees and members of civil society. So we had several chief data officers, for example, throughout the executive branch. We have people who are experts at federal, state, local, and tribal transparency.
And maybe it's important to understand what the committee and what the people that created the committee feel is transparency, because there are a lot of mechanisms that the government puts out information on, and almost every agency has publicly available data. So what was the grand challenge here with respect to transparency?
Well, our scope was very broad. So the idea was to bring together experts to have them decide what made the most sense. So we have people, for example, the former head of the Office of Information Policy, who was just fired last week, who is an expert on FOIA. So you talk about the Freedom of Information Act. I'm an expert on data transparency, so things like federal spending transparency and accountability. We have people who were experts on the courts. We had someone who was responsible for bringing video to the state courts in the state where he works. And we had journalists as well. So we had the entire spectrum of folks, including experts on how to make it so the public can better engage with the government so they can understand each other better. So it's really all the different aspects.
And how did it work functionally? Did it have regular meetings, or you said it was formed late last year, so probably not too many? And how did it operate?
So we were working really hard. No, absolutely right. So we were supposed to only meet on a quarterly basis, but we knew that we were behind the 8 ball in terms of timing. With the new administration coming in, we wanted to be able to work with them well. So instead of having quarterly meetings, we were having monthly meetings, which is a lot of work for volunteers, which is what everybody there, this was on top of their regular jobs. So we were meeting quarterly as well and doing work behind the scenes. I was working probably 10 hours a week towards the work of the advisory committee. And one thing about federal advisory committees is you're not allowed to deliberate outside of the meetings. So the meetings would be quite long, and we would bring in experts from the government to sort of help advise us as to what we should be doing so that we could meet the government's time frame to make recommendations, which are due at the end of this year.
And who were the recommendations made to when they did come up with them?
To the GSA administrator, who would give them to the White House. The White House is ultimately responsible for the open government plans. They're the ones who have to come up with these challenges for government to be more open and accountable, as well as getting commitments from the agencies to improve their processes.
And what recommendations were you able to get over the line before the White House changed?
So we were getting ready to make recommendations. That was the next step we had. So we were building the airplane as we were flying it. This had never existed before. I had wanted a federal advisory committee focus on this since 10 or 12 years ago, and we had drafted legislation to that point. We had gotten to the point where we had figured out how we would evaluate our recommendations. We were working through the ideas that we had, and that is when we were paused and then canceled.
All right. So any potential ideas that looked like they were bubbling up, though?
Oh, yeah, there is a long list of ideas. Everything from better implementation of FOIA. So when you ask for information, the results of your FOIA request should all be available on a central website that you can track. We had suggestions that we were working on for improvements for federal spending transparency. I had worked, as you know, for many years on the Data Act, and we had recently enacted the Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act that requires all agency reports to be available on a central website. But there were some implementation problems, so we had ideas for fixing that. We were also looking at requiring all court records to be publicly available through a system called PACER. So the recommendations covered the gamut.
We're speaking with Daniel Schuman, Executive Director of the American Governance Institute. He was chairman of the former Open Government Federal Advisory Committee. And how did the end come? Just from a memo, or did someone march into a meeting and say, "You guys are done for"? How does it come down?
Well, the first thing that happened is we had a meeting set up. We had meeting, because it takes a very long time to schedule these meetings. So we had a meeting that was coming up, and we were told, "Can't have the meeting. You're on pause. Your charter is going up for review." And the next thing that we heard, got another email saying, "Thank you for your service, but pursuant to the president's executive order, you've been disbanded." And if you go now and look at, we had done a lot. If you look at the website, on the GSA's website, that's one of the many websites that they've taken down. It no longer exists. All the work has been wiped away.
Wow. Does anybody have a look back or way back Google machine copy of it somewhere?
Yes, actually, that was one of the last things I did. Was I went and I talked to the folks at the Internet Archive, and I made sure that a copy of it still exists.
Right, because if you go to whitehouse.gov, there's never been another president of the United States.
Oh, if you go to whitehouse.gov, there's nothing, from the visitor logs to many of the press releases, even many of the EOs, all of that stuff the White House website is a disaster. It is missing tremendous amounts of information that should be publicly available.
Yeah, I miss the stuff going back to old administrations because even, Bush and Obama, and even the first Trump kept all that old stuff. And now there's no history.
Yeah, the National Archives has it, although the National Archives have had their own problems with the head of the National Archives and her deputy both getting summarily fired recently. The Internet Archive has most of those things. There's a web crawl, as you know, that happens at the end of every Congress. So it's preserved, and it's preserved independently of the National Archives because, unfortunately, they're in the process of taking things down as well.
All right. And one issue I think we might have spoken about a while back was a very detailed issue, but for those that have to deal with government regulation and proposals, it's an important one. And I think the Trump administration, perhaps ironically, had put guidance documentation for regulations on agency websites. And the Biden administration did not post those kinds of things. Did that ever come up in your deliberations, the idea of the guidance documents in the words of the agency about what they really meant when a regulation was proposed or established?
No, it was on the roadmap. So where we were is we were going to have civil society come and testify before this. They created a blueprint for accountability. We had requested a member of Congress who was going to come and speak. Next week is Sunshine Week. We were going to have them come and speak at next week's meeting. And regulations was knowing what the government is asking or requiring you to do is a really important issue. And that was on the list of things that we were trying to address.
And have you approached anyone in Congress that might, not that Congress can get anything done, but that might mandate this or say GSA shall establish an open government advisory committee?
We did. So I've had those conversations. There is interest from relevant folks on the relevant committees of jurisdiction. And this idea isn't a new one. You and I spoke about this a million years ago. There was this idea for something called the POIA, which is the Public Online Information Act, which is, 15 years back now. And one of its provisions included creating a federal advisory committee focused on making sure that public information is available to everyone. So this was not a new idea. We were finally getting the opportunity to work out this idea and see if it would actually make our government better.
And it's not only not a new idea, it's not a particularly partisan idea either, is it?
No, transparency, open government, accountability are not partisan issues. I've worked with people from all the way to the left and all the way to the right, and people who are not on the political spectrum. And this is something that we can all support, because whether you want a bigger government or a smaller government, you need to know what your government is doing, and this is how you do it.
And if you want something like ammunition to lob at the other side, then that's how you get it also.
Facts matter. And this is the way that you figure out how you can have those political fights. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts.
Daniel Schuman is Executive Director of the American Governance Institute. He was chairman of the former Open Government Federal Advisory Committee. Whatever your job is, great having you on as always.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
And we'll post this interview along with a link to his essay at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.